Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. For many years, Makoto Fujimura has been a friend and a guiding influence on my own life, and on the lives of many others. He's a leading contemporary artist whose slow art, as he calls it, has been described by David Brooks of the New York Times as a small rebellion against the quickening of time. His work, which can be found in the link in the show notes, gives us an opportunity to see the world and hold the world and engage the world with the kind of hospitality that becomes generative, even in the midst of pain and suffering and challenges, alongside the beauty and hope of light, of joy, of refuge. For reasons you're about to find out, I'd like to dedicate this particular episode of Conversing to Jane and her grandmother, Julie. Mako, what a gift it is to have you today on Conversing. Thank you so much.
It's great to see you and great to be on this conversation.
You know, the first time I recorded a video with you was many years ago now, and it was in the loft that you were using as your studio, very, very near Ground Zero, a few years after 9/11, where you were literally weathering all of the things that were part of that extraordinary occurrence and all that it's happened since. We then later had opportunity to spend much more time together when you were at Fuller as the director of the Brim Center at Fuller, which were challenging years for you and for me, and the fellowship that we shared in that time and your art and your artistic sensibilities very, very positively shaped me and things that happened in Fuller during that time. So I've interviewed you one other time when your book on faith and art came out, and now we have a chance to talk about your most recent book, Art Is. And so it just feels like a rich, long, I hope lifelong conversation that just continues between us. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
You know, Mako, I want to try to sum up an experience that I had recently that holds a great deal of why I think this book is so powerful and why it felt like such a gift to me to be able to read it. I was already in the middle of reading it, and I had was probably half or three-quarters of the way through. I went to Minneapolis to be part of demonstrations there related to ICE and trying to affirm again the essential importance of human beings and individuals, regardless of their contexts and legal or illegal status, and the fact that they were treasures, but it was in a city visibly, viscerally marked by trauma and violence and anxiety, but also the beautiful witness of 50,000 people marching together in 35 degree below zero temperatures. I came back and I was wanting to talk to a close friend of mine, a beloved friend named Julie, about the experience of being in Minneapolis. And I sent her a text. She's recently become a grandmother again. And a few months ago, she fell and sustained a very significant ankle injury and had surgery with pins in it and is only now just beginning to start walking a bit. And it was in light of that I wrote to her to say, could we talk? And she said, I'm sorry, I can't talk this afternoon. I made it up Annie, her daughter's stairs. I made it up Annie's steps and was holding Jane. Now, there was something about that constellation of words, this beloved friend, this embattled city, this person fighting a physical injury that she's healing well from, and the exquisiteness of this simple 2-word phrase, I was holding Jane, that just blew me away. It felt like this is of the essence of human making. It is
Yes.
the essence of life-giving making. It's the essence of grandmotherly care for a brand new little baby. And when I read this book and felt you were pointing us toward art is, and as the subtitle says, art is a journey into the light. It felt to me like this was Jane, this book was Jane, but also that what you were trying to point us to artistically is really a world in which holding Jane is really what life is meant to be about.
Yes.
And how we do that, how we live that, how we enact that, how you do that, in the particular forms of art that you express. And I'd like to just hold that in our minds as we have a discussion about this really rich book.
Thank you. I cannot imagine a better way to read my work that I'm hoping that the reader will experience this opening up in their own lives, to recognize something as maybe ordinary or as extraordinary as holding your granddaughter. And I think it was Calvin Silverfield who said there are burning bushes everywhere. We just stop taking our shoes off.
Yes.
And so I wanted this book to serve as a portal entry. I wrote a book about new creation and theology of making, which leads to these moments, I think, when we recognize that it's not just that we are making or we have the capacity to make a gift given to us by the Creator, but that we are being made. And when we recognize that moment, time stops. It becomes that in itself, that image becomes a portal that we get to carry into everything that we do, everything we make. So when I was writing this book, it occurred to me that very thing that I am unconsciously observing every day, the minute particulars that William Blake talks about, seeing a world in a grain of sand, becomes a way for us to understand our time, complexity of our time, to behold the fractures, to understand how unbearable it might be. And yet there are these moments when we are able to see the whole, step back, and to actually be filled with thanksgiving. Despite everything that's going on, you become more aware.
Right. I think it will be helpful to remind listeners a bit about your own story in a brief way, just so that people understand what you're holding together in your being. that can take hours and hours, and I wish there was opportunity for that. But in this case, just remind viewers who may not know, and tell viewers who might not know anything about you, to understand more about what you're holding, both as you come to life period and as you come to the life of an artist.
Well, there's a lot, and I suppose the reason why I write is to make sense of it all. I was brought up, my father's a renowned research scientist. So I was born in Boston because he was doing his postdoc with Noam Chomsky, people, and then traveled to Sweden. My first visual memory is of Sweden, and I talk about my early painting that I did when I was 3, and my mother kept and framed it and gave it to me for college graduation.
Yes,
as if to say, I saw your gift early, and I've done my best to steward it. And then I went to Japan. My formative years were grade school in Japan, and beautiful town called Kamakura, which comes up in the book often because I think that was such a formative aesthetic base for me and continues to be. And even though I went back to America, my father was at the famed Bell Labs doing pure research in acoustics research, and which built a foundation of AI and voice recognition systems, and in so many ways his research has been so generative, and this word is not just incidental. It is a word in which he built his career. And when I write about culture care and generativity and the effect of how culture wars rhetoric has so broken us into violent pieces, and we don't know how as a culture to even speak to each other, I am invoking my father's language of, language is generative. Language has potential for us, to reach across the divides, and it is always formative. And if we don't understand that, we don't understand humanity in that sense. So given all that background, I felt called, even though I did not have faith of any kind in college, but I felt called into the arts. I felt like there was only one thing that I could do, and I know people tell me that it's impossible. I know, that I think it's not possible, but I really needed to make a go of it. And that was my first year in college. I knew that instinctively, and I remember having a conversation with my professors about this, and thinking back, it was very unusual that I had the confluence of liberal arts education with sciences mixed in, and I was able to write sentences that I do in this book, which kind of goes from observations to making art in my studio here in Princeton, to thinking into interdependency of how perceptions work and how that might help us to heal as a nation. All the language there, I think, somewhat depends on a framework that allows very broad way of understanding the universe. And as a scientist, my father always had this outlook that we don't really know much. Like what we know, we might know, and then data will tell us if we're right or wrong, but you have to test it. And even if you are sure, then if you're certain about something, you have to question that, because you will look at data that way, and you don't really know what you know. And that framework, that epistemology really helped me, I think, to become a Christian. I think my father was very honest, even though he was not a believer or religious in any way, but he I think, understood the mystery of life and appreciated it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mako, one of the things that is powerful in the book is you describe the sort of insider-outsider life that you've had. I think this is a very important theme of the book. I think one way to describe the book, there's several words that I think describe this book, but one of them is it's the most intimate book I think you've written. And it gives us much more of an understanding of your own journey in strengths and in weaknesses, in times of struggle and pain, external but also internal. And one of them that is captured is that apparently the actual script in Japanese for your name would indicate in Japanese that you are, quote, not Japanese in the same full-fledged way.
That's right.
Tell us about that and what that means to you.
Japanese is written three ways. One is through Chinese characters, or kanjis they call them, and they put you learn in school, in grade school, so many hundreds of these ideograms, but in between, or how you begin is by phonetic alphabets. And there are two types. One is katakana and one is hiragana. And hiragana is something that elementary school children will use to begin to write. And then the kanji becomes this visual ideogram. So if you are learning Japanese, especially as a child, you are learning to think visually. And you're learning to hear the sound or as a kind of a lyrical poetry. It's a very elusive language. It's sometimes hard to translate Japanese, especially novels written in phonetic form. And so that is a really interesting way to look at how I write, right? So I think in my first chapter I say, I don't write in a linear way. I don't. So reader, you might be frustrated that it's not propositionally laid out and it doesn't have, point A to point B to point C. It kind of meanders, but I write in a way that as you journey into it, that you will find many more connections than you would otherwise. And that's the way I paint, so layers and layers, over sometimes 200 layers of pulverized minerals. So there's prismatic light and layering. Every stroke your eye can see, but your brain says, no, that's just monochromatic blue, But as you stay with it, it opens up to you. And my writing is the same way. There are many layers. There are many ways that words can act as prisms. And they refract, and depending on what you're going through at the time, it may read differently. And so I try to be honest to that, but I think it comes from the Japanese way of speaking about something, but you do not speak of the solid truth of it directly. You come around it, describing its shape and what color is it, and what do you hear when you encounter this reality? And so I think you're right that this book is very intimate, because I feel like it was the first time I've been given permission, first to myself, but also the wonderful editor that I was working with at Yale Press really encouraged me. This book came out really at the tail end of the shutdown. And she said, let's make a beautiful book. And by the way, I don't think you need to feel like you have to explain everything in your writing. That's what we kind of, typical publisher will want you to make sure that and she just gave me permission to meander and to let words refract. And once I began that process, it was such a healing process for me, and I think that's why it became intimate, because I was threading into experiences that I wasn't even aware of, and it just comes out of your writing, and you recognize it, and you say, well, do I want to go there, first of all? And you say, well, I think this is where this sentence is leading me to, let's pursue it a little further.
Yeah. Well, I love the way that it comes out, because as a result, it helps the reader settle in for that sort of experience, right? And it's an invitation to know you more, but it's also an invitation to then let the resonances, the intertwined resonances. We've talked about this on other occasions, but I've always been struck by what I've read about the fact that in music making, it is partly the notes, but it's principally the overtones that are the things that cause us to experience the depth and richness and moving power of music, right? And I felt this was an overtones book. That would be another that would be another thing. The notes sound and you hear them clearly, but there is this quality of resonance that just continues to resound in its own particular set of ways. Early in the book, you describe how you were drawn to a particular kind of Japanese aesthetic, which is really core to the way that you approach all the work that you're doing. So can you just explain that again, and then tell us, I want to explore about how that unfolds.
Yeah, even theology, right?
Yes.
That's what I discovered is like, scriptures when I read, I think I'm more aware of how much aesthetics and imagination is involved in understanding the passage. And, when the Spirit opens our eyes to see anything, but especially the Word of God, we have these first certain presuppositions, but we also have framework, lens through which we see things, and it's important to recognize that. And I think it took me a while to understand that my art, which is really committed to and driven by Japanese history, especially 15th, 16th century, 17th century Japanese art, using the materials that I use today intentionally to slow me down, to harken back to that time of enormous violence in Japan, and yet there were forces that created beauty as a form of peacemaking, as a way to slow down intentionally, to commune in a deeper way as human beings, and do not let the divisiveness and polarization and all that was happening, the civil wars that was happening, distract us from being human. And so in that sense, it is an invocation to that reality where art had to function in a way for us to remain human. And that you can speak of the same way about Frangelico's paintings, or any artwork actually at any point. But I do feel that what the framework of that understanding that we have lost our way as human beings, and we are caught up in this algorithmic, phantasma of reality that we think we are improving as human beings when we are not. And the same old darkness, the problems of the heart, is only amplified because of technology. And yet, the antidote to that is being able to go into the studio and make, right? So when I, lived and worked in Ground Zero for a long time, 15 years, I was there after 9/11. So we were literally, my children are Ground Zero children. They inhabit that really appreciation of community and creativity and imagination because they had to. They literally walked out to Ground Zero every day to go to school. I'm so proud that they all grew up in this tenacity, to this defiance, to remain human, to value their friendships, to have hope for the future despite what they see. And so these are things that I think the book, although I don't speak about my family that much, I allude to them, these experiences of loss and confusion and, my own sense of despair can actually lead into a place of honesty and way to connect with people who are going through that right now. And I know that, part of my way of writing about everything from bluebirds to, Dr. King, has something to do with that sense of being made alive in truth and goodness and beauty that allows me to stay in my studio, being able to make something, come into the studio with expectation that a new creation will happen.
Right. One of the words that you use early on is this word hospitality that describes both a Japanese aesthetic and the way that aesthetic affects you. And what you just, I think, have said is an example of a telling of hospitality, right? How do I take the horror of 9/11 in all of its trauma, which it definitely was for you, and I'm sure was for your children in different ways, but a genuine trauma for every possible understanding and reason that it should be such. And at the same time, that it become hospitably welcomed for the sake of the generative implications of letting something like that really speak to you. Mm-hmm. One of the other words that could be used, I think, to describe this book is, there's a cluster of words, but for now I'll use the word simply attention. It's a book about paying attention, back to holding Jane. It's this it's this attentiveness that is not objectifying, but intensely subjective, and holding all of the particularity, including the shards and the ash and the messiness, as well as the things that are exquisite and beautiful and so forth. Talk to us about hospitality as a life and also as an artistic expression.
Yeah, and I'm a high introvert, so I struggle with hosting anybody, And yeah, I think what my 15 years living and working and raising my children in Ground Zero and helping with church plants, helping with what that taught me was that you can only see Jesus if you see God as hospitable, providing that place, sanctuary, in the midst of trauma, in the midst of Ground Zero, right? So Ground Zero can be a place of devastation, and it is. And, I walked around Hiroshima and Nagasaki thinking about the amplified trauma that I can't even imagine, and talk to the generations of survivors, and listening to them made me realize, and I didn't like using the word survivor because I didn't feel like I survived anything. I was just, yes. And then it took me a Columbine high school survivor to tell me, because he read one of my books, he said, you're welcome here anytime, because you're also a survivor. And it just shocked me when he said that. And then I realized he was right, that I owned a responsibility to that. And I can't be in denial of the trauma that I was carrying without knowing that for a long time. And it really is a discovery of layers and layers of things that I needed to reckon with, I needed to understand in my own ways. And God is so gracious, to allow me to do it through my art and to be able to write about that process, just track it a little bit, closely. And so that word hospitality has become such an important word when I'm talking about my art, and when I'm talking about listening well to each other, listening to the culture, listening to the city, the hustle and bustle, the pulse of it, and understanding that rhythm of whether it be a sentence that you just wrote or a flow of minerals that's cascading down your canvas, or attentiveness to the shift of light that happens in front of you. No moment is the same, and you are continuing to discover things. And then when I realized that God is indeed the host, the hospitable, that God is the God of Ground Zero, that's when I started to shift even understanding of Ground Zero as, two words, place of devastation, to say, can this be also a place of cancellation, Ground Zero, place of forgiveness, place where you intentionally host tea to the enemy, to the warlords, to the powerful? Can this be a place, a birthing place of art? All of that came about, and I think it's evident in even this book. Every sentence I write is connected to that thread.
Right. It is a very prominent thread. And I think it speaks to the long story of holding Jane, in the sense that it starts in this way that is just exquisite beauty and smallness, and yet the long story of Jane's life yet to unfold is a story in which Jane knowing that she's being held, Jane being free while being held, to risk, to create, to extend, to grow her own sensibilities in the world, to understand community, to be in relationship, to suffer, and to be nourished and full of joy. All of that is part of the story that's unfolding. And the question is, for every human being, how do we find the capacities for that? And I think this book gives us so many, I guess what I came away thinking of as sinews that sort of connect us to the tissue or the muscles that need to actually embody something. But we need the sinews to understand how all that actually is going to hold us together when it feels like so much about the world and life can feel like it's a splattering exercise in the current culture rather than anything but a culture care or nurturing exercise, right?
Yeah. The sinews are often hidden and not, doesn't reveal itself to be, but it's holding things together. Yeah.
Yes. One of the other words that I would use to describe this book is that it's, for me, the most mystical of your books. And what I mean by that is not something extravagantly supernatural precisely. It's more that mystical experiences hold mystery. And there is a deep vein of mystery that runs through this whole book about the mystery of existence, being, the mysteries of matter, of pulverized minerals, etc. There's a mystery that is unfolding. And there's this one very unexpected and classically Mako expression of this, which I just relished, which is a description that you give of dandelions. I wonder if you could take us to the dandelion and reflect a bit on that. I thought that was really, really, really so Mako-like and so wonderful. So,
well, thank you. I live in 3 acres of land here, which I never had any land, before living in New York. And so it's such a eye-opening experience and just sense of discovering what is a land and what does it do. And, it's a farmland, and it used to be cornfields, I suppose, and acres of farmland here in Princeton. But then I also began to see things, right? You stay with a place that you live in, and you begin to pay attention to the details. And of course, growing up in New Jersey, somewhat, I had a certain bias against dandelions.
Of course.
Lawns are not, fighting against it or whatever. And a writer friend of mine just visited me one day, and she noticed this, like my inclination to, love all things except dandelions. I was maybe complaining about how they take over. And she said, well, why do you hate dandelions? And I just paused and I thought, why do I hate dandelions?
Why do you hate dandelions? Yes.
And so that kind of spiraled me into this meditation, which art is ultimately about. It's really stopping, right, and saying why, and then observing, and then diving into it, and as if it's a Jungian dream, you kind of analyze it. And so I've been doing this, and then I wrote about this trip that we had to Quebec, and I was forced to walk on the side of this highway, and I noticed these weeds, but they were beautiful, and it turns out to be they're cousins of dandelions. And I was reading this essay about Lydia Trotter, who is this artist, missionary, extraordinary individual, and she takes dandelions to a higher level. She says, well, dandelion seeds, they form these pods, and they give themselves away to the wind, that they don't even know where they're going. And so I did some more research, and it turns out that dandelions only grow in compacted and sometimes toxic soils. They intentionally land, or the ones that land in the places that need them, they will create these deep roots, break up the soil, and they're the superfood because they have all the nutrients packed in them to fight against this culture of death,
Yes,
and fight into it, I guess, and to make it come alive, right? And they fly somewhere else, and they do the same somewhere else. And so they're really amazing plants that I had no idea did so much for the world, And so when I was thinking about this book, and I thought, well, it'd be kind of nice to have little images, in between like chapters, like dingbats, And so I painted a dandelion, and my designer thought it was just the most wonderful thing I ever done, and I was just giving it to him just to use on a little thing. And he said, "Oh, I'm going to put this on the cover," And I said, "What? Why?"
Stop! I thought we were moving together on this.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden he sent me an image, and I said, "Wow, this is quite something," because that thread, right, the initial thread, right. If I didn't listen to my friend, who was really challenging me to see the world differently, if I didn't push into this reality and what dandelions do to, soil, if I didn't pay attention to that, I would never seen the weeds on the side of a highway in Quebec City. I would just walk right past it without thinking about anything. But that moment, they spoke to me because I have been thinking about this, holding on to it. And then as I wrote these words, it is my favorite chapter in the book because it opens us so much about the process of seeing.
It does.
And how we don't see, how we are learned. We are educated not to see, ignore those things. And then once that part, it's like the Matrix, once you dive into the rabbit hole, it is just so full of dreams and realities that we have dismissed as something that is not useful to society, something that is, like the perfection of green grass is what we're after, and that assumption has done so much damage to us and our children and to this culture, the political process, everything, and it just unravels in these paragraphs in this chapter.
Well, it ties in, of course, deeply to one of the phrases that you use to describe your own work and the work of other artists. But this idea of slow art is critical to the things we've just been talking about, right? You don't get to where you got to about dandelions in a speedy way, right?
No.
It comes as a result, as you were just saying, of the pausing, waiting, observing, holding, the letting it speak to you in ways that the hurried realities of culture and the instantaneousness of digital access and supposed communication is just is leaving all of this out.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And it's kind of a communion because you make dandelion tea and you actually drink it and chew on the roots and it turns out to be the best thing for my allergies. It's heating my body, and like this is what Jesus meant, I think. Love your enemies, right?
Wow.
It's a little bitter, but
right, a little bitter, yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, there's another section of the book that is not too long after that I want to focus in on, which is a section that you call rest. And it just strikes me, for example, the word, of course, is an extremely rich word in the Bible and has a great deal to do with how people come to know how to live in reality and rest, Sabbath keeping of some kind, whatever that looks like. Sabbath keeping is an invitation to, in the biblical sense, lay down your labor in order to receive and remember that you're not the one who holds all reality. And there's a quality about rest in art, in your art, in some art. So I wonder if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I think, I have another book called Silence and Beauty, which is based on Shusaku Endo's book Silence.
Such an amazing book.
Yeah, which is an amazing book, but it is the opposite of rest, right? It's about trauma and persecution. And yet it is about rest. It is about Father Rodriguez realizing that he cannot attain the things that he's supposed to attain as a priest in 17th century persecuted lands. And kenosis of giving himself away in like a dandelion seed, it had no control over where he lands. And yet that beautiful act of surrender becomes an entry point to Endo's, I think, thesis is that that's the way that Japanese Christianity can endure in underground and beyond, right? So it is the opposite of, writing about silence of God. Endo kept on saying that this is not about the silence of God. It's about the voice of God speaking through silence. And Sabbath is like that when we work so hard and we have, ways of validating our existence by proving to the world that this is what we've done. And yet it is when we are able to behold and allow ourselves to be filled with gratitude for things that we haven't done, we have no control over, that if we can surrender to the winds and let it carry us, that becomes a new place where, we might land and take root. And that, to me, is one of the most powerful witnesses of art. And we can define art differently. And I say in the book, this is not about defining art, but it is about the existence of art, And so art is, it exists in a way for us to navigate our complex times, but to also allow us to rest, allow us to give pause to this incessant drive to dominate, to win, to validate whatever the process is, whether it be political, cultural, or economic. It actually does not accomplish what it promises. Many of these are assumptions that we don't question in our world, but we need to understand that maybe by resting, which has been proven to be true, if you rest one day a week, you're more productive, far more productive. Same thing with our minds and our imagination. We need a place to land. We need to look at something beautiful, something that speaks to us, listen to music, go see live theater, and let that be a place of germination without expecting anything to happen. And this book is really about that. It is about me slowing down enough to write a sentence simply about what I see without expecting to do anything. And that kind of unraveled, and became this book. So I think that process can be traced in every single person's life.
Well, your editor was absolutely right to give you permission to let these stories unravel. And it is like seeing strands of something and and feeling their inherent coherence, while also realizing there's mystery, uncertainty, risk, courage, all these things that I think emerge as well. We've talked a little bit about this. You've referred to it, and we've talked a bit about it in the past, but I'd love to have you maybe conclude our conversation with talking a bit about kenosis. I know you're thinking a lot about that, and kenosis is a Greek word that is basically God's self-emptying love, identified in the context of the Christian faith as what Jesus does both in the incarnation and the crucifixion. But give us your reflections.
Yeah, it's such a rich, deep word. These paintings behind me are part of the series called Kenosis. Part of it is in the process. Gold, Japanese gold, is microscopically thin, and gold is very expensive material, and yet it is malleable. The pure gold is something that breaks up into these polarized patterns. And so I wanted to do a series of paintings that address this, the opposite of self-expression. In a sense, it kind of is a way that art, like dandelion seeds, can give itself away to the world. What would that look like, and how do I capture that? Well, simultaneously, my wife, Hye-Jen, a justice advocate, was giving a talk for this very important group talking about generosity. And she chose that title because she thought, if we're going to talk about generosity in the world, we have to understand kenosis. And she's continuing to develop this thesis as a lawyer, advocate, in so many ways. And we see this as a movement. Kenosis, kenotic movement, is kind of the antidote to everything we're experiencing, the exposing of all the corruption and power games and lies. And it is to hold that silence as Jesus stood, being accused, remaining silent to carry the cross. And it is, again, not a show of weakness that the label that the world may put on that. It is actually the opposite. It is the most powerful speech. And it is a way that, as I thought about it, philosophy has always addressed this, Wittgenstein to Foucault, to say that language is inadequate to create a way for us to communicate that does not rely on power structures. And every time you use words, typical culture war rhetoric is all about dominating, dismissing, eliminating, right? And so words have become so much about, so-called survival game, but it's really debased form of that. And so I think part of kenosis life, whatever that may be, it's something I would love to explore more deeply with a community of people who have different expertise, because this is when I look back on the cultures and civilizations that have outlasted its traumas and darkness and wars, I think you'll find this at the core is somebody decided that it's okay for me to give my life away. and that person, even though the voice may be tiny, small, invisible, flips the table, flips the dynamic of the entire power struggle that we have built upon. We are thinking that is going to be enduring, but it's actually the crack that causes polarization of power. And then out comes this new forest of beings that is so resilient, so defiant, so human that all of education, all of what we do, even in terms of capitalism, is just drawn to it. We just know instinctively that this is the only way that we can move forward into the future, or even to imagine the future. And it turns out to be the imagination of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
It turns out to be that. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. This is the way, that one of the ways at least, that we can begin to speak into the current crisis of power.
Right. It reminds me, once again, as we close, of Jane and the hope for a tiny baby, and imagining this life nurtured by a family who will be intensely present and loving and embracing of her uniqueness, that over the course of her life, and she has 2 priceless siblings as well, how those young children will emerge in life, and whether, as you're suggesting, whether self-emptying releases their imagination. So to hold Jane is to hope that Jane will develop in every possible good way, with the imprimatur of good way. In fact, I think what Paul means in Philippians is this sense of doing that which really matters, is a self-emptying life of love.
Right.
And I thank you so much, Mako, for the way that you do that, and for the way that your gifts through art and writing are manifestations of that, and have been for many, many, many years in my own life. And I just want to express my huge gratitude for that giving, which has changed me. And I'm very thankful for that.
Well, I'm grateful to sojourn into this and unpack so much of what I intuit has a lot of ramifications that I cannot bring into reality, because my gift is to be able to articulate a little bit of what is really happening. And I'm grateful for you and so many others, friends who have come alongside and become part of my own way of processing and journeying. And because of that, I think, I have been, talk about a secure base to work from. I think there are elements of that even in this conversation, your hospitality. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be part of that.
God bless you. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.